Who told you to stop playing?
I appreciate what you're showing me right now.
Despite Max Payne easily being one of the most influential games of all time, surprisingly, we haven't really had that many clones of it. And really the main ones that come to mind are Total Overdose, Dead to Rights, Wet, and then case in point John Woo's Stranglehold. A video game sequel to his seminal 1992 action flick Hard Boiled. Which, along with A Better Tomorrow 1 and 2 and The Killer, are must-watch movies for anyone who's a fan of watching people shoot lots of guns. It's also interesting to consider Stranglehold's connection to Max Payne, in the sense that a game like this would have never existed without Max Payne in the first place. Considering that Max Payne is really responsible for popularizing the whole bullet time mechanic in video games, and something like Stranglehold can arguably only exist because of that. But then the weird part is that Stranglehold is a canon sequel to Hard Boiled, a movie which undoubtedly influenced Max Payne in the first place, as being an incredibly over-the-top and action-packed experience, letting you play as Chow Yun-Fat's version of Dirty Harry with Inspector Tequila, a badass, alcohol-swilling, no-nonsense, chaotic good cop, who does whatever he needs to do in pursuit of the greater good.
Don't stand anywhere, Captain. They just get in my way.
With Stranglehold absolutely capturing that same intensity and vibe of the character, probably because John Woo himself was involved with the game's development.
The way I like it.
You're the only one who does.
With the game being developed by Midway Studios, but also Woo's fledgling development company, Tiger Hill Entertainment. Right, so before I get too far into things, I do need to thank this video's sponsor, HelloFresh. This month, HelloFresh are giving all new subscribers a totally free breakfast item with every single delivery. Not only making breakfast the most important meal of the day, but now also one of the easiest. But there's also way more options to support your health journey than ever before, including over 50 dinner choices to suit any kind of lifestyle, with there being over 30 calorie and protein smart recipes each week, with your fresh, pre-portioned ingredients delivered right to your door with zero hassle. You can choose when and where you want things delivered. You can even skip a week at no charge if it doesn't fit in with your schedule. And as the months and seasons change, so too do the menus, with recipes changing constantly. Now for me, we started using HelloFresh at home back when our son was born, simply because we often didn't have all that much time to go out shopping. And HelloFresh absolutely came in handy there and just given us one less thing to worry about. But even if you're not busy and instead not fussed about cooking day in and day out, well, HelloFresh really offers up a simple and easy alternative, so you can spend more time doing the things you actually want to do. So click that link in the video description or use my code to get 10 free meals plus a free breakfast for life. Now that's one breakfast item per box, while subscription is active when you're in the US. Outside the US though, the local discount's going to apply. And once again, thanks to HelloFresh for sponsoring this video. Now, the story here revolves around a war between three main triad groups. You've got the Dragon Claw, the Imperial Nines, and Golden Cane, with Tequila brought into the whole thing after a cop is murdered. With the game kicking off at the Kowloon markets where he's looking for evidence before it's all but confirmed that the guy's been killed. Yeah, in pretty brutal fashion too, outright executed at point blank and with a really grisly photo showing his demise. And after clearing out the markets, he ends up at a nearby tea house, interrupting a deal between a bunch of I-9 and Golden Cane members.
You brought a cop to our deal?
Boy, that escalated quickly.
Which, let's be honest, is really just an excuse for the developers to include a bit of a throwback shootout inside a tea house. From here on in is where things start to get a bit muddled, as Tequila meets up with the Dragon Claw leader named Jimmy Wong, who he has personal ties to considering that he dated Jimmy's daughter Billy, even knocking her up with his Chow Yun-Fat, and the two of them having a daughter named Yuko. He's also told that all of this drama has been staged by I-9, who are secretly working with the Ukrainian mafia out of Chicago, who have kidnapped Billy and Yuko to make Jimmy play ball.
Zakharov took him from the house in Chicago 2 weeks ago.
How come you haven't sent anyone to chop him into pieces and bring Billy and Tico home?
So Tequila then heads to Chicago to try to rescue his daughter, only to then end up having to go back to Hong Kong after dealing with the Ukrainians. where it in fact turns out that Jimmy was behind the whole thing all along. Yeah, and he would have gotten away with it too if it weren't for those meddling kids. To add all of this, you've also got Tequila's boss, Chief Lee, who in typical fictional police chief fashion, just shows constant frustration towards Tequila's methods without ever actually doing anything about it. Yeah, despite the guy breaking every single rule in the book repeatedly.
Watch your step, Tequila. You go out of bounds, you'll lose your badge.
Along with Tequila's buddy Jerry, who's working undercover with Golden Kane. And despite being supposedly Chinese, looks more like Paulie from Jersey Shore.
I walk in there, my cover's blown.
And there'll be 2 missing cops.
I mean, I don't know what the term actually is for an Asian Guido, but either way, this guy's it.
Mr. Wong wants to talk to you.
And that actually also brings me on to one of the main things that's always bugged me about this game, is how all of these main characters speak English, with a few of them even having American accents, you know, despite the whole thing being set in Hong Kong primarily. Like this dude, for instance, named Locke, who kinda looks like Chinese Vin Diesel.
Young wants me at the Mega. The Imperial 9 deal is going down right now at the center table.
Compare it to something like Sleeping Dogs, which came out a few years later and has a similar theme, but also has a much more appropriately sounding voice cast.
First girl ever sucked my cock.
Now my guess here is that they did this because it was 2007, and the demographic for gamers back then was a lot younger, so they probably assumed that people didn't want to be reading subtitles. And either way, like, it's not a huge issue, and I'm not about to start posting a meltdown about it on Twitter, but it is just one of the minor things that truly prevented this from feeling like a proper sequel.
Suit yourself.
One thing they did absolutely nail, though, was that sense of pure chaos you get when the bullets start flying. Something which John Woo's films also did amazingly well, where people would fire guns and the results would break the very laws of nature. Stranglehold is also one of the earliest games to ever use that Unreal Engine 3, and it's still kind of impressive in the amount of stuff that can be going on at once here, even in just the sheer amount of ways you can shoot things, where it seems pretty much every single object in the environment reacts to getting hit. And outside of maybe Fear and Black on the Xbox, I can't think of any other shooter that has such a high level of player-controlled destruction. Even Max Payne, despite it also being quite chaotic and over the top, still had a sense of realism and normalcy when it came to shooting up things around you. I mean, there was a sort of understated restraint to the physics and the particle effects, in the first game anyway, whereas here in Stranglehold, it's kind of like all of this stuff's just been dialed up to the nth degree. They've done a really great job of modelling in Chow Yun-Fat here as well, and a lot of his outfit choices throughout the campaign just epitomised the kind of thing that we all thought looked cool back in the mid-2000s. One of my favourite little details is how whenever you take cover, you can see the walls being shot apart around you, and Tequila even flinches and winces in pain as bullets fly past his head. All of these destructible and explosive elements in the environment also usually have a twinkle on them, really hinting to the player that they should be shot at. Kind of like the twinkle your mum gets in her eye after she's had a few daiquiris and finds herself in the mood to smoke on my meat pipe. And it's all just there to encourage the player to be as creative as possible with the shooting, and make things look as cinematic as possible. And considering that this is based off the same movie that opened up with an action scene where someone slides down the side of a staircase while firing their gun, well, then it all starts to make sense. I also think it's kind of crazy looking back here to when people used the Unreal Engine 3, how the visual style would usually be vastly different across all these titles. I mean, compare how Arkham Asylum looks, for instance, to something like Borderlands or Bulletstorm. Whereas nowadays, with the supposedly modern and more advanced Unreal Engine 5, it's like every single one of those games has the exact same aesthetic. Oh yeah, we absolutely need to talk about the music in this thing as well, if not just for the sheer talent that worked on it. For starters, you've got Sasha Dikician, who, among a whole bunch of other things, did the awesome soundtrack for Quake 2, along with Prototype and even the Borderlands games. There's also Chris Velasco, who again worked on Borderlands as well as the Mass Effect series and 40k Space Marine, and then finally Jamie Christopherson, who did the music for Metal Gear Rising. And I don't know which one of these dudes came up with that music you hear on the main menu, but that is without a doubt some of the coolest shit I've ever heard. More so I think as well because this is one of the very few games that actually has an interactive menu, with the whole thing shifting around depending on what option screen you're actually in. Overall, the whole thing just has this 2007 era charm, and it really hasn't aged all that much at all, where shooting apart collapsing pieces of the scenery and watching the whole thing crumble down is really still as entertaining now as it was 18 years ago. But of course, none of that's really going to matter all that much if the gameplay isn't there to back it up, right? Well, thankfully, it is.
Stop! My penis can only get so erect.
Now, compared to Max Payne, who was a pretty basic dude when it came to his athleticism, Tequila, on the other hand, is far more agile, able to move at a much faster speed, along with jump dodging in any direction. But more than that, he's also able to interact with the environment in a whole heap of ways. He can leap across waist-high obstacles, for instance, he can run up the railings on staircases, or even just slide down them. He can swing from light fixtures, he can jump onto moving carts, all of which activates something called Tequila Time automatically, which is the game's own brand of bullet time. Now, Tequila Time fits somewhere in between how bullet time works in Max Payne 1 and then Max Payne 2. Where in Max Payne 1, bullet time is really just an extension of Max's reflexes, limiting his movement speed but not limiting how fast he could aim. And then in Max Payne 2, the bullet time was more or less a superpower, slowing down time further the more kills you made, to the point that you moved at about normal speed, but everything around you had essentially stopped in place. So what we got here is really the best of both worlds. You still easily have time to make precise shots when it's activated, but you're also definitely breaking a few rules of the Matrix as well, showing off some inhuman movement. And there is a point to all of this stuff as well, because the more creatively you kill the enemies, the more you earn stars, which then goes to fill up the Tequila Bomb gauge, giving you access to 4 main abilities. The first of which is a healing move, which restores a small chunk of your health, and that's kind of handy early on, but later in the game, when everyone's got assault rifles, that's really just a drop in the ocean compared to what you'll be losing. So that gauge is far better spent on the other abilities, like the next one you unlock, which is the precision shot. Now this lets you fire off a single round, which, boss enemies aside, kills everyone in a single hit. What it does is basically turn your weapon into a sniper rifle, along with giving you this hilariously gratuitous death animation unique to the body part you're hitting. So if you shoot someone in the head, for instance, then they're just going to fall to the ground in a pretty boring way. But shoot them in the neck and you'll hear them gurgling and choking on their own blood. Or without a doubt, what is the funniest one of all being the nut shot, where shooting someone in the baby maker ends up having them grabbing their junk in pain before then falling to the ground. Which is without a doubt the single greatest dick shot in all of gaming. And also more proof that genital trauma is just hilarious, as long as it's not happening to you personally.
Oh!
The final 2 abilities you've got are more designed for clearing house, with Barrage and then the Spin Attack. With the Spin Attack being this highly cinematic one where you see those very familiar looking white doves, as Tequila spam kills all the enemies in his near vicinity. But as far as I can tell, this is only limited to 3 or 4 enemies at a time, and it also drains your entire gauge with a single use, versus the vastly superior Barrage. And although for this one there is a time limit, there's no limit to the amount of people you can kill, with this thing lasting around 5 or 10 seconds, giving you invulnerability as well as unlimited ammo, where you've just got free reign to run around as you please and mow everyone down. What I think is really cool too is how it differs depending on what weapon you've got equipped, with this unique animation of Tequila loading up his guns before he then goes on this mini murder spree. Though I think you do kind of owe it to yourself to use this ability with the shotgun, simply because that animation of Tequila loading in a whole bunch of shells at once is just too badass. Now speaking of the weapons, it is actually a pretty basic roster there, and honestly, Stranglehold's biggest shortcoming, Also as well, because you can only ever carry 2 at a time. Now the first one you'll be using are the dual Berettas, which is an all-time hood classic, and like all the other guns in the game, you never need to reload these, which is about the one saving grace that they've got. It's also probably supposed to be a nod to some of John Woo's films and how characters would often fire their guns for days without ever needing to reload. Occasionally too, you'll come across gold-plated Desert Eagles, which are about as rare as photos of your mum with her clothes on. And these have the very handy benefit of killing enemies in a single hit. But also, more importantly, shredding through the boss fights, assuming you can be buggered to hold onto one for that long. Next up, you got the submachine guns and the assault rifle, with the submachine guns clearly being based off an MP5K. And then the assault rifle, I think being based off what looks like an M4. Like the pistols, you can also dual wield the SMGs. And although they might not do as much damage as that assault rifle, and are often about as accurate as a garden hose, running around with 2 of these things is definitely going to earn you the most cool gamer points. And I genuinely struggle to think of a better combination than bullet time and dual submachine guns.
It's true.
When it comes to the shotgun, we ain't here to fuck spiders either, with Stranglehold giving you a semi-automatic Spaz 12, and again, one that never needs to be reloaded. Now this thing is about as effective as harsh language at long range, but utterly devastating at medium to point blank range, taking out pretty much every enemy in a single hit. Even beating Max Payne in that regard too. You know what I mean? Because the pump-action shotgun in that game was fucking garbage. The thing is, while I do appreciate a Spaz 12 as much as every red-blooded, meat-eating, Sydney Sweeney-loving man does, a part of me wishes they would have included a Benelli instead, or at least even just a standard pump-action, considering that in pretty much every single John Woo movie, those were by far the ones that seemed to pop up the most. I mean, there is that one sequence in A Better Tomorrow 2 when Ken kills a bunch of dudes with a Spaz 12, which admittedly has one of the funniest moments in any John Woo film.
Fuck you!
Outside of what has to be the most insane fried rice related dispute.
This fucking fried rice stinks! Holy what?
But I don't think a single one of those things even showed up in Hard Boiled. And even that iconic poster shows Chow Yun-Fat holding a pump action. It's also an incredibly missed opportunity that they didn't include some kind of automatic variant as well, like a street sweeper or the jackhammer that we got in Max Payne. The thing that sucks as well is that they've clearly modelled one of these things in, because when you go to the video options in the main menu, you can see a gang member holding onto one in the background.
Here I come.
Still though, the shotgun serves its purpose in helping to remove a triad member's soul from their body, which at the end of the day is all it ever really needed to do. For the final couple of guns, you've got the heavy machine gun, which sadly only shows up properly in the last level. And then the rocket launcher, which again, only really shows up at the end of the game. Even the grenades, as awesome as they are, and yes, they are pretty fucking awesome, really only shows up when you're about 2/3 into the whole campaign. So overall, like, it's not a bad lineup, but it's definitely lacking a couple of variants for each weapon type that would have really helped to make things a lot more interesting. Like maybe having a revolver or something alongside the pistol, a MAC-10 or an Uzi that uses up submachine gun ammo, or an AK-47 to go into that assault rifle slot, considering the sheer amount of gun porn we get in John Woo's movies, with that serving as an incredibly extensive database of weapons that they could have pulled from. It's just kind of weird that they went for such a garden variety lineup. The most important thing about all the shooting though is that each weapon needs to feel fun to use, which I'd argue that they all do. And Stranglehold really is just the kind of game that you'd never see made anymore, at least definitely not by a AAA studio, where the concept of an entire game is literally just running around and shooting at people in slow motion. I also feel like it encapsulates that era where every single game element was coming together to create this larger slice. And the thing for me that really timestamps this as something made in the mid-2000s is the amount of ways that you can kill enemies by using physics-based objects in the environment. Like shooting an air conditioner, for instance, so it falls on someone's head, or shooting down a large pile of rubble so it crushes everyone underneath it. And it's like we had such a rise of games doing similar concepts like this with things like Half-Life 2 and Dark Messiah of Might and Magic. and it's just like developers stopped trying to be creative anymore, and no one ever bothers putting this kind of stuff in games these days. I just did a video on Avowed last week after having played that thing for like 30 hours, where there wasn't a single instance in that entire time where I could crush a single person under a pile of rocks, or make a piece of the scenery fall down on their head.
Meanwhile,
Stranger!
And yet here we are with a game in 2007 where I can shoot apart every little object I see, and cause a humongous neon sign to crush a bunch of people at once. Even those brief moments when you're in standoffs with the enemies really show off this kind of creativity as well. Now this is the mechanic where at key points throughout each chapter, Tequila finds himself in the middle of a triad or Ukrainian gangbang, with a gunman coming at him from every angle. You've then got to quickly dodge either left or right, literally dodging bullets, shooting back at all of these enemies as they come at you one by one. And often, shooting the nearby objects is going to kill them in even more flashy and dramatic ways. It also helps that the campaign never really bogs you down into one place for too long, and usually after a couple of minutes you've moved on to the next area and have got a fresh supply of bad guys to kill all over again. You'll go from the slums and markets to the nearby islands and harbour. You got a casino/restaurant, fancy penthouse, city museum, more slums before then finally a fancy estate for the finale. And visually, these are all vastly different, so you never feel like you're doing the same thing twice. In fact, it's only really that second chapter that feels like it's dragging its feet. Now, the first chapter goes exactly how you'd want it to. Takes place in a bunch of back alleys and abandoned markets, giving you a whole bunch of basic bad guys to shoot at, but more importantly, inanimate objects, with almost every single prop able to be shot at, causing it to explode in a gloriously over-the-top fashion. There's lots of options for environmental interactivity here as well, with plenty of neon signs able to be destroyed, often causing them to fall on nearby enemies. And you can run up or slide down the railings for countless staircases throughout the area. Like it's suddenly turned into Tony Hawk's Pro Skater. For the second chapter though, now you're out in the middle of this shanty town near the ocean, and your first task here is to destroy a bunch of drug labs, going around and shooting these things until they explode. Something which you have to do like half a dozen or so times before you can even move on. Then after that, you head onwards into the next area where you have to do the exact same thing all over again. Goody gumdrops.
Goody gumdrops.
After blowing up a bunch more of these, Tequila gets into a chopper and then gets to fire a machine gun at a bunch of guys on the ground, which is fun initially and showcases those hilariously over-the-top ragdoll physics. But then it also just seems to go on and on. And the fact that there's more or less no challenge to any of this makes it seem even more tedious. I mean, maybe on the consoles with a controller it could be a bit tricky to try to hit everything, but this is really just a slowly moving shooting gallery, and on the PC I find myself shooting at things on the side of the screen before they've even come properly into view. Eventually you get off that chopper, and then your objective is running around this large expansive area, planting C4 on 4 different boats, where you then get this unskippable animation of the boat exploding and slowly sinking. Every single time. Followed by placing down more explosives, this time 14 of them across different structural weak points at the nearby harbour. Before finally and thankfully the mission comes to an end, easily clocking anywhere from 45 minutes to even an hour to maybe get through.
I was doing you a favor.
And it's not that any of this stuff is bad, but just consider this pacing to that opening chapter, where you blasted through the whole thing in about 10 or 15 minutes, to now suddenly doing the same couple of objectives over and over for closer to an hour. Thankfully though, things pick up again in the third chapter, where you're now inside this triad-owned casino trying to make your way to the top floor, initially having to survive wave after wave of gunfights against these constantly attacking thugs, placing down guitar cases stocked full of ammo in strategic places so you can fall back on these things during combat. And this is actually a pretty nice change of pace, to suddenly find yourself hunkering down in these mini arenas, which almost kind of feel like mini deathmatch maps. Plus this chapter also has what is without a doubt the best moment in the entire game, where you're suddenly in a standoff with this poor jazz band caught in the crossfire.
Who told you to stop playing?
Then you've got this extended gunfight where these guys are forced to keep playing on in the firing line. If all of the band members are killed during the shootout, it's game over. So it becomes this incredibly tense sequence where you don't want these guys to be killed for compassionate reasons. But also just because it's a scientific fact that jazz music during action scenes is fucking awesome. And you want that backing track to be there as long as possible. And yeah, if you don't agree with me that jazz music makes any action scene about 10 times as awesome, well, go check out Cowboy Bebop and then get back to me, bitch. The next one after this though is hands down my favourite, during the point in the story when Tequila first arrives in Chicago, starting out with a really fun fight inside a parking garage. And if Max Payne and Fear have taught me anything, it's that bullet time and parking garages go hand in hand for awesome shootouts. Oh yeah, and also too, speaking of Max Payne, it's kinda hard to not be reminded of the final few areas of that game during all of this as well. With Tequila then moving through this super high-tech, expensive-looking apartment on the penthouse floor, along with dodging laser traps and attack choppers as he hunts for answers. I mean, honestly, this whole thing could have served as the finale, and yet here we are, only about halfway through the whole campaign with a really challenging sequence. Now, the chapter after this, set in the History Museum, I've always found to be the most ludicrous one in the game. And the premise here is that the bad guys are having a meeting to discuss their plans, only for Tequila to then show up and spend the next 20 minutes in gunfights destroying all of these million-year-old fossils and dinosaur bones. There's a fun little stat there you get at the end of each chapter where it tells you how much damage you caused about all the carnage. And look, like I don't know what the going rate would be on entire dinosaur remains, but I'm gonna say that you can't really put a number on it. This is also the point as well where the game has a serious spike in difficulty, with armored enemies showing up from here and a lot of sequences where your vision's obscured by smoke grenades. For story reasons that I won't spoil, Tequila ends up back in Hong Kong after this for what's one of the shortest but also the most challenging chapters in the entire campaign, where you're moving through these slums in the middle of a heavy thunderstorm as the water is constantly pouring down around you, making for some really cool looking moments when you activate bullet time, but also some of the toughest moments, where the visual noise can get to the point where it actually becomes tricky to even just identify enemies. Plus, it was also the first time in the game where that low FOV really started to fuck with me and get me properly disoriented. Visually at least, this whole chapter does look pretty great, even if in this instance it does often make it impossible to see jack shit. It's for the final chapter though, where they really aren't messing about. And this is without a doubt the hardest one by far, which, yeah, you would kind of expect. I mean, in that starting area alone, you've got to shoot your way through a few dozen enemies, as well as then taking on a chopper in this kind of mini boss fight. All of which without any checkpoint in between. And as well as that, you've still got the final boss fight, which is against two at once, in between fighting waves and waves of the regular enemies who keep spawning in, and again with no checkpoint in between any of this. And like I said before, like, I've never played this thing on the consoles, but honestly, like, I can't imagine how you'd get through this thing on hard mode, let alone normal mode. I mean, on the PC that was tricky enough. Now, I'd be lying if I said I wasn't disappointed that the whole thing didn't end in a hospital shootout, but either way, once you take out Jimmy, that's the end of Stranglehold's campaign. As Tequila gets his badge back, he's reunited with his daughter and then walks off into the sunset, well, sunrise. Once you finish the story, which is only going to take you 4 or 5 hours, you can also go back in and replay any chapter you want, even skipping through to all the various checkpoints. There's an unlockable store there as well, with even Mr. John Woo himself making an appearance.
Good choice.
So, although it is a short campaign, it's definitely not a one and done kind of experience. I'd say the overall thing that Stranglehold has working against it is that it really doesn't ever differ up in its gameplay loop. And although there might be a few variations here and there, ultimately all you're going to be doing is just shooting the same looking guys over and over. If you're into that, then it's perfectly fine and you're going to have a fun time. But if you find that stuff boring early on, well, then chances are that that's never really going to change the more you play. Fortunately, I've always loved this kind of thing, and it is one of those games that I find myself reinstalling at least a couple of times a year, then just blasting through it in a few sessions. And in fact, I still remember that when this game first came out, I turned down going to a mate's birthday party because I wanted to go home and play through this instead. Heh, no regrets. But the most disappointing thing about the game is that despite it reviewing and even selling quite well, they never made any kind of sequel. Now, there was a sequel in the works, and it was apparently going to follow on from the events in Stranglehold, even being a kind of buddy cop story, including Vin Diesel as one of the main characters. There's even like a little hidden area inside a theater where it's playing a trailer for the game, so clearly they were cooking up something big there. The legacy of these old bullet time era shooters does still live on in some degree, but mostly just from indie titles, with things like El Paso Elsewhere, Trepang 2, Severed Steel, and Maximum Action, with the latter even having an entire level dedicated to a shootout in the hospital from Hard Boiled. I can't see Chow Yun-Fat or John Woo coming together anytime soon to make any kind of movie sequel, and I seriously doubt we'll ever get a video game follow-up either. But Stranglehold still lives on as a great example of that bygone era, where AAA games used to be fun, and where shooting someone in the dick truly never got old.
Oh!